Greetings to all. Even though Mr. Obama gave this important speech during his election primary, I believe this speech will be relevant for as long as race is an obstacle to unity. We, the people, in order to form a more perfect union, 221 years ago, in a hall that still stands across the street, a group of men gathered and with these simple words launched America's improbable experiment in democracy. Farmers and scholars, statesmen and patriots who had traveled across an ocean to escape tyranny and persecution finally made real their Declaration of Independence at a Philadelphia convention that lasted through the spring of 1787. The document they produced was eventually signed, but ultimately unfinished. It was stained by the nation's original sin of slavery, a question that divided the colonies and brought the convention to a stalemate until the founders chose to allow the slave trade to continue for at least 20 more years and to leave any final resolution to future generations. Of course, the answer to any slavery question was already embedded within our Constitution, a Constitution that had at its very core the ideal of the equal citizenship under the law, a Constitution that promised its people liberty and justice and a union that could be and should be perfected over time. And yet words on a parchment would not be enough to deliver slaves from bondage or provide men and women of every color and creed their full rights and obligations as citizens of the United States. What would be needed were Americans in successive generations who are willing to do their part. Through struggles and protests, on the streets and in the courts, through a civil war and civil disobedience, and always at great risk, to narrow the gap between the promise of our ideals and the reality of their time. This was one of the tasks we set forth at the beginning of this campaign, to continue the long march of those who came before us, a march to a more equal, a more just, more free, more caring, and more prosperous America. I chose to run for the presidency at this moment in history because I believe deeply that we cannot solve the challenges of our time unless we solve them together, unless we perfect our union by understanding that we may have different stories, but all common hopes, that we may not look the same and we may not have come from the same place, but we all want to move in the same direction, towards a better future for our children and grandchildren. This belief comes from my unyielding faith of decency and generosity of the American people, but it also comes from my own American story. I am the son of a black man from Kenya and a white woman from Kansas. I was raised by the help of a white grandfather who survived a depression to serve in Patton's army during World War II, and a white grandmother who worked at a bomber assembly line at Fort Leavenworth while he was overseas. I've gone to the best schools in America and lived in one of the poorest nations. I am married to a black American who carries within her blood of slaves and slave owners. An inheritance we pass on to our two precious daughters. I have brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, uncles, and cousins of every race and every hue, scattered across 3 continents. And for as long as I live, I will never forget that in any other country on earth is my story of impossible. It is a story that hasn't made me the conventional candidate, but it is a story that seared me into my genetic makeup, the idea that this nation is more than the sum of its parts, that out of many we are truly one. Throughout the first year of this campaign, against all predictions to the contrary, we saw how hungry the American people were for this message of unity. Despite the temptation to view my candidacy through a purely racial lens, We won commanding victories in some of the states with the whitest population in the country. In South Carolina, where the Confederate flag still flies, we built a powerful coalition of African Americans and white Americans. This is not to say that race hasn't been an issue in this campaign. At various stages in the campaign, some commentators have deemed me either too black or not black enough. We saw racial tensions bubble to the surface the week before South Carolina primary. The press has scored every exit poll for the latest evidence of racial polarization, not just in terms of black and white, but also in black and brown as well. And yet it only has been in the last couple of weeks that the discussion of race has taken a particular divisive turn. On one end of the spectrum, we've heard the implication that my candidacy is somehow an exercise in affirmative action. It is based solely on the desire of wide-eyed liberals to purchase racial reconciliation on the cheap. On the other end, we've heard my former pastor, Reverend Drammeh Wright, use incendiary language to express views that not only have the potential to widen the racial divide, but views that denigrate both the goodness and the greatness of our nation, that rightly offend white and black alike. I have already condemned in unequivocal terms the statements of Reverend Wright that caused such controversy, for some nagging questions remain. Did I know him to be an occasionally fierce critic of American domestic and foreign policy? Of course. Did I ever hear him make remarks that could be considered controversial while I sat in church? Yes. Did I strongly disagree with many of his political views? Absolutely. Just as I'm sure you have heard remarks from your pastors, priests, or rabbis that you strongly disagree with. But the remarks that have caused this recent firestorm weren't simply controversial. They weren't simply a religious leader's effort to speak out against perceived injustice. Instead, they expressed a profoundly distorted view of this country. A view that sees white racism as endemic and that elevates what is wrong with America above all that we know is right with America. A view that sees the conflicts of the Middle East as rooted primarily in the actions of stalwart allies like Israel instead of emanating from the perverted and hateful ideologies of radical Islam.